The following discussion is for entertainment purposes only and should not be considered any kind of financial advice. Welcome back to the Jump Pod, where we talk about all things Web3 and gaming. My name is Christopher Albrecht. I am your co-host, along with Mr. Grant Hart. We're both of the Universe. Grant, how you doing?
I'm doing well,
I'm glad to hear it. And I am so glad to be talking to the people we are talking with today. So the Universe, just for people who aren't familiar, is a community-owned franchise is what we like to call it. And part of that means that we are putting like this world-class team, putting tons of resources into creating the story of the Universe, all these digital assets, and then we're basically handing it over to the community and to anybody who wants to use them. And that's kind of mind-blowing. I think that it gets a little bit lost when people think about NFTs and video and, the whole video game space. And so one of the ways we were able to do that is because we brought on our guest today who helped set up a content license for us. We are lucky today to have Christian Williams and Ryan David Williams of Ashbury Law Firm. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the Jump Pod, both of you.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
Chris, happy to be here.
So I'm going to just quickly, I'll have each of you just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about sort of your role in, I guess, the kind of law that, because there's like Web3 law and then there is intellectual property law. So Christian, because you're on the left-hand side of my screen as I look, I'm going to start with you. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background?
Great. So I'm an intellectual property lawyer, and there's a lot of different kinds of IP, but my focus is copyright, trademark, is pretty much what I do all day, every day. So copyright and trademark is my specialty. Awesome.
Ryan?
Yeah, and I'm kind of a Web3 generalist, I guess you can say. I don't know that many years ago when I went to law school, there was such a thing as a Web3 lawyer, but I used to work in big law firms, and in 2016, I started Ashbury to focus exclusively on, I don't think it was even called Web3 at the time, but crypto, blockchain, that's morphed into NFTs and gaming and a lot of the stuff we're talking about, metaverses, and a lot of stuff we're talking about today. So I'm just really happy to be here and happy to be involved with literally all things Web3.
Awesome. Yeah, Web3 firms don't need lawyers, do they? It's all pretty ironed out. I'm kidding.
Yeah, code is law, right? That's it. That's all I got to know.
It's all decided. It's all, close the book. Everything's figured out. So, we don't want to, we're actually not going to be talking that much about Web3 today, although we could probably, ask a few questions since we got you around, just in your thoughts on it. But in general, we want to talk about the Universe Community Content License, which you both put together. Thank you again. So why don't we just start with the basics? What is the Universe Content License, and what does it let the community do? Christian, I'll let you take that one.
So the word license in the legal world just means permission. And so the community license is a massive permission to anyone in the world to say, hey, come join us. Come help us build the universe. Come be a part of this franchise. And specifically what it does is it says we have these things called Universe Community Assets. And the assets can be artwork, audio files, music, code. It could be an asset could be a lot of different things. And it says you can take these assets, anyone in the world, and you can let your creativity run wild. And not only can you let your creativity run wild, you can also monetize the things that you make. And so whether people want to launch their own line of sneakers, whether they want to create their own comic book, cut a new album, create a short film or a feature-length film, all of these things are possible because of the community license. And so it's this massive permission, and really what it is this massive sharing of intellectual property.
I love that, Christian. That's huge, right? Because, it's not only are we giving the assets, essentially as a permission. I love that use word permission, because I think licensing can be, confusing to some people, right? If they're not familiar with law or they're not familiar with just a business sense, right? Like licensing can be kind of, jargon to some people. And I love the term permission, because that is exactly what we're about, right? We're like bringing the community to everyone, right? And bringing in the assets to everyone. So I think that's a huge deal, and I appreciate you explaining that. Ryan, I want to ask you a question. How is this unique, right? Like, how does this differ? And why does this matter? Why, as a community member, should a Universe, community holder, right, care about this?
Well, it's a good question, Grant, and I think I think what we're doing with the Universe Community Creations license is unique, not just when compared to Web 2, obviously, but also when you think about Web 3 and what a lot of other projects are doing in the kind of NFT and metaverse in gaming space. But to start with kind of the obvious differences from a Web 2 world, historically, content creators, think Disney, would carefully guard their intellectual property. As a little exercise, try drawing a picture of Mickey Mouse and selling it on eBay. I dare you. Disney will come down on you with the wrath of God very quickly, and they'll have an army of lawyers to stop you. And I think they do this for a few reasons. The financial aspect of it is obvious, but they also want to maintain, I think, kind of complete creative control over their characters and the worlds that they create. So Mickey Mouse will always look and behave exactly how Disney wants him to. And so why does that matter? And, in the context of the Universe, I think that IP rights are the key to transforming video games into metaverses. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So when I talk to folks and friends and family about the metaverse, I often get asked, well, hey, aren't kind of these, MMORPG video games like World of Warcraft, like aren't those already metaverses, right? There's a lot of people all hanging out in digital worlds, interacting with each other, mining gold or what have you, right? And it's a reasonable and fair question to ask. However, I think the key difference from my perspective is that in these traditional games, the gamers are impacted by the worlds created by the developers, but they aren't actually impacting those worlds themselves. In other words, the video game developers have complete creative control, just like we just talked about in the Disney example. And now, I think in order to kind of transform those worlds into what we're kind of thinking about currently as the metaverse, the players must be able to exert control and influence over those games themselves in order to kind of make it their own. And in order to do this, the developers must relinquish that total and complete creative control and over their IP to the users. So as Christian, I think, perfectly said, the users and the gamers' imaginations can run wild. And I think that is, if we're talking, practically speaking, I think that's, in addition to the ability to monetize and create, sneakers and lunch boxes and short films, and that's all really, really, really cool and really powerful and kind of democratizing and egalitarian. But I think, in terms of the experience that the Universe is creating, I think they're building more of a metaverse than a video game. And this is my words, not the words of the Random Games team, of course, but I believe that's what we're helping them create by turning over this IP to the users.
One thing that one project and game, really, I shouldn't call it a project, but one company and game that I'm a huge fan of, based on numerous reasons, but it's Fortnite, right? Epic Games has done a very interesting job at, creating this behavior of a metaverse style, right? Where you have different skins, they have virtual concerts, right? Travis Scott, Ariana Grande, right? Like these things have happened. But one thing that kind of came to my mind when you were talking about creating and letting the community create is when they had this feature on the game a couple of years back called The Block. And on The Block, they actually gave permission to players to create their own version of a map, a small version of the map. And so they actually would pick winners, right? And they would use that part of the map and feature as The Block. But you think about it, that's a very small example, right? If you can actually have a game or map, right, in an actual game that was fully created by the permission, right, Christian, of the assets, right, that we give out, I think that takes it even, and it pushes the envelope, right? You have probably more engagement, more creativity there.
I want to get a sense from you, Christian, about the state of sort of the IP world in the digital world, right? So, because a lot has happened over the past few years. Because I think about, so when I was at Atom Films, we held the Star Wars Fan Film Awards, right? And you could create your own Star Wars clip. It was an official thing. We partnered with Lucas, right? But at the beginning, it was very specific. You can only do music videos or parodies or satires. It could not be, You could not try to write your own Star Wars story, right? And that changed the last year I was there. But, there's this sort of ongoing I don't know, push and pull between digital technologies and what they allow, and copyright holders. You know, is it still life of the creator plus 75 years for a copyright?
Yeah, it's actually, I believe it's 95 years for copyright.
Okay.
So it's quite a bit of time.
Can you just give me a sense of like where we're at in the copyright intellectual property world? Are we going to see more things like this, or are people like kind of going the other way and exerting more control and holding things more tightly?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, especially right now, because especially larger brands are trying to figure this out. And so what brands have realized is that when you have a really great fan base who loves what you're creating, coming down on them really hard with a cease and desist letter isn't always the best look, especially in the time of social media and Twitter, where what they're going to do is turn around and put that cease and desist on Twitter, and now you really look like the bad guy. And so brands have been trying to find this balance, but then sometimes it backfires. A recent example is Bridgerton, the Netflix show. So Bridgerton, massively popular, tons of fans. And then there were two individuals on TikTok who, inspired by Bridgerton, created this musical. And there's now this huge lawsuit about it. And what's come out in the lawsuit is that behind the scenes, Netflix was in communication with them, trying to be very specific about saying what they could and couldn't do. But then they ultimately, in Netflix's view, stepped out of that box. And now there's this lawsuit ongoing. And so brands, I think, are struggling to decide, what does it look like to let go? Can I let go? Is it to my benefit to let go? And that is very much actively bubbling right now in the copyright world.
Right, because the union, you know, I wonder what some of the challenges were in creating this license, right? Because not only are we saying, yes, you can go create your own TikTok video with our characters, use our actual character models, right? But then you could also charge for it. Like Ryan was saying earlier, you can create a lunchbox and you can turn around and sell it. Like, I've really never heard that before. What were some of the challenges that you had to go through to make sure that this license was expansive enough to where it was, you know, truly sort of open, but narrow enough to where it's still, you know, we at the union are protected, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And one of the biggest things we were struggling with was intellectual property law itself. And I'm going to get a little nerdy and dig into the history.
Yeah.
But what I've always thought was really cool about IP is that it started with the Constitution. So intellectual property law is Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which I find wild because the Constitution is this really short document, and right up front, only like 8 paragraphs away from We the People, is a section on intellectual property law. But what that section actually says is that Congress has the power to give people exclusive rights. And so for as long as the U.S. has had intellectual property law, it's been about exclusivity. It's been about keeping people out. And it's in a lot of ways an extension of traditional property law. If you think about, you know, what is traditional property law about? It's about saying, this is my land, no trespassing, right? And so intellectual property in many ways is an extension of that. And then when we think about when these laws were passed, the Copyright Act, as we know it, was passed in 1976. The most U.S. trademark laws, as we know them, though they've been changed since then, were passed in 1946. So when you think about where was technology in 1946 when we got trademark law, where was technology in 1976 when we got the current version of copyright law, and you can see how there is so much catch up that needs to happen. And so to answer your question, Chris, really we were grappling with a bunch of laws that were always meant to keep people out. And what we want to do is the exact opposite and welcome everybody in. And so the challenge really is intellectual property law itself and all the ways that it needs to catch up. And so that was the challenge we were grappling with as we were putting together this license.
Christian, you asked a good question. What was technology like in 1946? Chris, Albert, do you want to take that question?
I see what he did there. He called me old. No, but you think about so that is important because when you think about like if you even go back to 1776, right? In order to distribute something, you had to put it on horseback. And so if you didn't protect it for a certain number of years, there's just a physical time as people were riding, that were able to distribute pamphlets or whatever in between municipalities or cities or towns or whatever. And then, when you get to 1946 and 76, things are a little bit faster, but, you can't transmit pages in 1946. Whereas today everything is instant. If we release a character on the Universe, somebody can instantly download that, and thanks to the creation tools, can instantly, create something.
Well, and like also, before this show started, we were talking to Ryan, right, about your background, and you didn't get into Web3 or blockchain, right? Legality issues and IP issues until 2016, right? Like this is such a new concept, and I think a lot of projects and brands, Christian, because I think you bring up a really good point, is we see a lot of brands struggle with the entry point into Web3 blockchain because you hit it perfectly, right? It's like they don't know how much to give up. What is there? Is there too much to give up? Are we making a mistake? It is interesting. So, Ryan, like, how does this differ from other licenses out there, right? Like we know A16Z can't be evil, right? We have some examples of that, but how does our license differ?
Yeah, that's a great segue, Grant, because what I was just thinking when you just said, hey, where do we draw that line, right? How do we make sure that we're not giving up too much? And Chris, you mentioned something earlier about how do we make sure that Random Games is protected on all this and is able to continue to thrive as the developer of these Universe community assets. And I think, and to tie it in with Christian's aspect of kind of the ability to exclude folks. And so, one of the things that we grappled with was, for example, could let's just say I have a fantasy football NFT project and I want to give it to the community and open that up to everyone and break down these barriers to entry. Does that mean that DraftKings can go buy a couple of my NFTs and create a, NFT project based on the IP that I handed over to them, right? Like that doesn't seem right either. And so I don't think it's just these you want to blow the doors wide open and say anyone can use it for anything, including what if, there were just, causes that you as a company just don't believe in or don't want to support or just don't want to get involved in, right? And so figuring out those nuances was really critical. And I think that's one of the big distinctions between the Universe Community Creations license and the so-called Can't Be Evil licenses created by A16Z, which, by the way, I think are fantastic. They're very well done. They clearly had some great lawyers working with them on it. And I think they really did a great service to the whole industry by putting this out there and removing some barriers to entry. If you don't have the money or the resources to hire lawyers to create a custom license for you, by all means, they're a great place to start. But for example, they're very binary in certain aspects, including whether or not you can commercialize the IP, right? It's like yes or no. And if I say yes, then I have to be okay with, in my example, a DraftKings coming along and basically hijacking my intellectual property to do something that competes 100% with what I'm doing. And, that might be okay for some projects. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But a lot of clients we talk to say, well, I don't exactly want that. I want to get handed over to my community, to everyday users, to use it and monetize it. And so for that kind of nuanced distinction, the A16Z Can't Be Evil licenses might not be the perfect solution.
It's funny. I think. Sorry, but lawyers, I think, kind of get a bad rap. But it seems like a lot of the time your job is just to think of edge cases, right? So, what's a way that this is going to be abused in a way that is not? So, we should say that it is not a wide open in terms of what you can do with the Universe materials, right? So we put together a blog post. We'll link to it in the show notes. And there are some Unio no-nos. And I'm wondering, Ryan, if you can go through just some of them that we sort of, there were things like you alluded to, something like it was hate speech, right? Like we don't want that. We carve out video games, right? Software on top of that, right? Like there are some limitations.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just kind of just top of mind here, go through some of those. So you mentioned competition, right? So we want to make sure that people aren't going to use the content that we create and put out there for free to create other video games, other NFTs, other any kind of gaming experiences. We also don't want them to use our IP to violate the intellectual property rights of third parties, right? And so, for example, take some of our Universe community assets, combine it with Mickey Mouse, and now we're kind of entangled somehow in a dispute with Disney, right? Which I mentioned earlier. No one wants that for anyone they care about. We want to make sure you're not breaking the law or disparaging or damaging Universe, right? Or random games in that, or using obscenities or discrimination or fraud or defamation or belittling certain peoples or communities. Like, we just don't want to be a part of that. We don't want our assets. I'm kind of speaking for the Universe community here. We don't want our assets being used for things that we don't believe in, that impact our ability to thrive as an organization, and that might belittle or marginalize anyone out there in society. I think those were the high level ones. Is there anything else, Christian, that I missed?
No, I think that was great. And another one to address what you said earlier about DraftKings, and just to let people listening know, what this practically looked like was literally Ryan and I sitting down with the Random Games team, and one particular phone call I can think of in particular where we really sat there and stress tested these ideas and said, okay, what if this happens? What if this happens? And are we okay with this? And are we okay with that? And I think, going back to, your question, Grant, what makes this different is having that conversation, working through those issues. It's not easy to do. But one thing we did land on is realizing, this really is for everyday users, as Ryan was saying, and we decided to specifically limit it to say, okay, this is for individual users, maybe also some small businesses, but we put a very intentional limitation on it so that it could not be used by large multinational corporations, so that, a big corporation can't just swoop in, take a Universe asset and use it in their next advertising campaign. That's not really what we were trying to accomplish here.
I think it's very simple. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Ryan. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Grant. I was just going to say one other term that I think was really important. I mean, we could have been a little lazier and not stress test this as long as we did. If we just wanted to do what a lot of folks do out there with their terms of service, to say, hey, we can update this at any time with or without notice, and kind of pull the rug on you, and maybe any time or energy or money you've invested into creating that lunchbox is now worthless, right? We did not want to do that, and we very intentionally created we do have reserved the right to update this, but anything that you create before we update, that's yours, and you can use it in accordance with the old license, right? So we're not going to just be intellectually lazy and say, hey, you know what, we'll just pull the rug on you if we got something wrong. It was really important for us to get it right the first time.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and you brought up the stress test again because it's a perfect segue into just the as a insider looking in, but also an outsider from a Web3 perspective. It is nice to see someone like a Wyeth and Tony come from a Web2 gaming traditional background, but now be very close, right? That's kind of rare to be able to say, hey, look, I know what the community wants. This is what they want. We're in Discord with them. We're on Twitter with them. And we're willing to go through these stress tests, right? These edge cases, the what ifs, and actually cater to them. Because, Ryan, like you said, we see so many brands come out when they come into Web3 and say, hey, here's our TOS, right? Our terms of service. Like you said, we'll come back here and update this when we like. Or let's say, when someone thinks of something that they don't like, then they'll go in there and say, hey, you're right, we're actually going to cease and desist you. So I think it is nice to see, a project, a franchise like Universe, just get in front of it from day one and say, hey, look, we're connected to the community. We're stress testing this now.
Yeah. Like I mentioned earlier, I think what you're doing is not just different from Web3. Sorry, Chris, not just different from Web2 as I talked about, but different from Web3 as you just kind of pointed out, Grant. So, there's a lot of hype and ethos around granting intellectual property rights to, users or NFT holders. If you look under the hood, as we have, because we're kind of, Web3 legal geeks, and look at these terms of service, the vast majority of projects simply are not doing that. Mm-hmm. And so I think the fact that Universe is actually doing that, has invested a lot of time, energy, and money in doing it right, says a lot. And I think even if you look at some of the projects like a Bored Apes, right, where they do hand over that intellectual property, I think the floor price for a Bored Ape is like 65 ETH right now. And so, that's great. And that still is a change and improvement over Web 2. But if it costs me $75,000 to acquire IP rights, it's not very egalitarian or inclusive, right? I mean, if you think about it, even in a Web 2 world, if I had money and resources, I could acquire or license intellectual property rights. How different is that, right? But what the Universe is doing is saying, I don't even care. I mean, maybe we weren't kind of clear to listeners that this isn't about NFT holders. This is about anyone who goes on our website, takes a look at some of this content that's been created, whether it's characters or backdrops or storylines, and for absolutely free can use it, can build on it, can improve the universe, can monetize their creations in the universe. And like that is truly, truly special and unique. Again, not just from a Web 2 perspective, but even a Web 3 perspective.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, and
about.
Christian and Ryan, you guys can address this, right? Which is, and this is going to sound like log rolling. So forgive us. This is the Universe podcast. But if I think to another franchise that I know of, right? This is something, we're doing this from the ground up. I imagine it would be monumentally hard to apply this sort of retroactively to a property that is already in the people's minds, right? Like there would just be a thicket of agreements and licenses that are already in place. There's lots of money already out there, right? Like whether it's shows or existing licenses for bobbleheads or, all the other kinds of things. And even in the Web3 world, as you alluded to, Ryan, like we saw what happened with, Moonbirds when they switched over to CC0, right? Like, you just, happiness comes from setting proper expectations, or so I've been told many times. So I imagine, Christian, like from your standpoint, working with intellectual property holders, it's much easier to do this at the outset than it is to try to go back and tape it on later.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about this is a totally different example, but think about Netflix right now is trying to come around and say, hey, if you want to share your Netflix account with other people, you have to pay for it now. And people are up in arms, right? That's not making their community very happy. And so being able to say this from the beginning is also something that makes the universe very unique. Setting those expectations ahead of time, everyone can have a good idea about what they're coming into. And so, again, people don't feel like you're flipping the script on them later. And I think that also, whether it's true or not, when you make a massive change later, it can make people feel like, oh, what was your true motivation for that? And so doing it now, I think is very unique and also very important.
Christian, it's funny that you bring that up. So I've been a holder of numerous projects and blue chip projects, especially on the Solana side, that have done the same exact thing, right? Where they'll mint and they have a very successful mint. The floor price goes extremely high and people start pushing the envelope, right? They want to start selling coffee. They want to start selling shirts and things like that. And the project actually came out and said, hey, we actually changed some of the IP and some of the licensing. And you saw the community just go, what are you talking about? You've been knowing this for months now, and people are starting to, make money, make profit, and now you want to come out here and shame us. So it's not great. One question I wanted to ask, and this is, coming because I honestly don't know why this number exists. Explain it to me in pretty simple terms. Why is it that like the number of money that you could profit is $100,000, right? We've seen that number get thrown around a lot. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about, but usually like the licensing is like you can make whatever you want to make, but you can't make more than $100,000 in profit. Is that right?
Well, so we are sorry, Ryan.
No,
really quickly. So I think that's really, again, what we're seeing, this push and pull of brands trying to decide how much am I willing to give up and what do I feel comfortable with. I think 100,000 is probably more or less an arbitrary number. You just kind of have to start somewhere. And in the community license, in case people haven't seen it yet, we don't have that kind of limit. We're not saying, hey, only up to this dollar amount. We're not putting those kinds of limits.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, Christian. It's not a legal requirement at all. And I think where that came from is there's a lot of copycatters in this space, right? And maybe not have a lawyer. I'm going to go look at other projects and borrow their terms of service. And I'm pretty sure that started with the Doodles. So the Doodles had that $100,000 threshold, and then people just copied and pasted. I think that's the honest answer.
I think you're exactly right, and I just wanted to highlight that because I didn't know if there was some case or whatever whatever there was, whatever licensing that was out there, and it was just kind of copy and pasted. But it makes sense as to these Web3 projects saying, hey, Doodles did it, right? They're successful, and it seems like a nice arbitrary round number. 100,000 sounds great. So thank you for explaining that. I think the community appreciates that as well.
Ryan, I'm curious, again, I'm being sort of reductive with lawyers and your profession here, so I apologize. But, your job is to protect things.
We're used
right?
to it.
Yeah. So, the joke I always make is, across all technology here or to be invented throughout the known universe, right? Like just covering all of your bases. So Ryan, as you think about Web3 and you think about metaverses, was there anything that you needed to bake in here, or is there anything that you had to think about as you look ahead that you had to sort of, fold into this content license, or a sort of any approach as you continue to do work with us at the Universe?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd like to get Christian's thoughts on that too. So get ready for that, Christian. It's coming back at you. But from my perspective, I think one of the biggest challenges it was, we've talked a lot about what a user can do with these assets, but then what can other users do with the assets created by, let's call them user one, right? And so the ability to kind of piggyback and build on this. And so that was another kind of challenge I think we had, not just conceptually and from a business perspective and an operational perspective, but again, back to Christian's point of kind of coming up against traditional notions and case law in the intellectual property world. And so, for example, what if user one used some of our community assets, created an amazing storyline, but introduced a new character into that story? Right. And so now they're built on the universe, introduce a new character or a new storyline or a new backdrop or a new planet or whatever it might be. How can we use that? Right. So in other words, how do we keep this thing not this static? It's one thing to say, okay, go take a image of a character and put it on a lunch pail. That's pretty basic and simple. But how do we create this dynamic where each of these, we have the universe creative assets, and then we have these creations that are built therefrom, and how do we turn those into assets that people can keep building on? And so the idea here is to really allow for a world to flourish off the creations of everyone else. And so we're not just thinking about that next use on the lunch pail. We're thinking about how do we build a world, quite literally, that might be around for 50 years, and we have no idea what it looks like 50 years from now, but we need to make sure that people can use the creative kind of, genius of the community and keep building upon that. And that was kind of, I think, a unique challenge here when we're thinking about creating an immersive world, collaboratively.
Yeah. And to your point, Chris, lawyers are famous for throwing in everything and the kitchen sink, these massive legal run-on sentences that go on for a whole paragraph of all the things you can't do. And I think that because we're thinking of it from just the opposite way, one of the things that we did was actually keep it quite simple. And the goal was really to keep it simple and to keep it short. And then to grapple with, as Ryan said, okay, but how do we plan for the future? And, to be honest, I think technology has taught us all we don't really know what's coming or what's possible or what might be true even really 5 years from now. But by keeping it simple, I actually think that helped us to plan for the future, because the goal was not to say, here are all the things you can't do and let's try to capture every, little word that could express anything that might be invented. Actually, the goal was to say, okay, we want to give this broad sharing. How do we do that? And I think that flipping that actually helped us when it came down to the nitty gritty of actually writing out that license.
Ryan and Christian, I have a question for both of you guys. I wanted to ask this in terms of a feedback style question to projects and people that are maybe looking to start their own project or whatever the case is, or DAOs even, right? What is in your opinion, your experience in the space, what is the biggest area of opportunity moving forward in terms of legal, IP, licensing, we can see in Web3?
I can take that one first. And I would actually love to see some legal change in this area. To be quite frank, I don't know if we're going to get it on the copyright side, because for just as many people who would be excited to see change, I think there's probably just as many who like it the traditional way and who benefit from it being the traditional way. But I think that if there could be legal change, that would make it easier to share IP than it currently is now. And I just think that kind of philosophically, again, IP in a lot of ways is really about a scarcity mindset. It's about the idea that if you make $1, that's one less dollar than I'm making. And Web3 I see it as a completely different idea. The idea that, hey, if you make $1, that's great for you, because I actually think there's plenty of dollars out there in the sea, you know? And so laws in so many ways are written from this scarcity perspective, especially IP laws are written from this scarcity perspective. What would it be like if laws were written from a more abundance mindset? I think is just really interesting to think about. Again, not sure if we're going to get that legal change, but I think that would be something really cool to see.
I love that.
That was awesome, Christian. Yeah, I'm going to steal that for the next podcast I'm on.
That was great.
I'm like flustered to even try to follow in those footsteps, but very similar to that, kind of piggybacking off that idea is I think it's less about the technology and less about like changes to the law, because if anyone's sitting here waiting for Congress to figure this out and come on the same page, like, good luck. But what I think we're seeing is a shift in business models, right? A fundamental change in how companies go about making money, because that's the business they're in at the end of the day. But historically, it's been this idea of ownership, right? Like, I own something, which means I can exclude you from it. And if I can exclude you from it, I can charge you to access it, right? It's why a public park would be a horrible business model, because you can't exclude people from it. And just that right there, and that's the basic concept that built Silicon Valley, right? It's I own property, intellectual property. I get a patent on it. I own it. I can prevent you from using it. Therefore, I can charge you a monthly fee to access it. And therefore, I have future revenue potential, and I get investment, and I get acquired one day. I mean, that's the basis of kind of basically every Silicon Valley business, up to now. And I think what we're seeing now is a shift from this ownership and exclusion being the source of value to letting people use your technology as being the source of value. So, for example, no one owns the Ethereum blockchain, for example. It's still hugely profitable for a lot of folks. There's not a company behind it who profits from it, but for the validators and the miners, for example, it is, because rather than ownership of it, what it is it's the ability to use it and to access it and to pay gas fees for it, right? So it's not about owning the carnival anymore. It's about having tickets and letting people use it. And when that's the mindset, then, hey, patent trolls go away and I'm just going to own it and let no one use it, or I'm going to buy you to shut you down. That kind of mindset is archaic and disastrous and goes away in a world in which companies profit and benefit by creating something that people actually want to use. And only if they use it does everyone win. And I think there's a fundamental shift there that's just, quite frankly, good for humanity.
If people ever ask why did Random Games, why did Universe, work with Ashbury on licensing, I'm just gonna go look at these answers. You tell if you leave this show and you don't feel like you've learned more things, I don't know what to tell you. Amazing responses. I love that.
Yeah, but now I feel silly for dumping all that money into the public park startup I was doing. Anyway, look, we couldn't have had a better time. This is amazing. I wish we could talk for, hours on end, because there is so much more that we could mine in this discussion. But I want to respect your time and thank you both. Christian Williams, Ryan David Williams of Ashbury, thank you so much for being here. If people want to find out more about Ashbury, what's the best way to do that?
They just go online to ashburylegal.com, and right there they can book a free consultation, a free call with one of us on the team, and happy to answer any of your licensing, intellectual property, Web3, crypto, blockchain, NFT, metaverse, you name it. We love to talk about it. And similar to the spirit we talked about here, it's all free. So check us out, look us up, book a call, and look forward to talking to you.
Amazing. Christian Williams, Ryan David Williams, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll have you back as the Universe continues to grow and more unforeseen issues come up, because that'll be the fun of it.